You can begin, Marlene.
Good evening, everyone. It's a delight for me to be here this evening and introduce Jack Jedwab. Who doesn't know Jack? Jack is the president of the Canadian Institute for Identities and Migration, and he's also the president of the Association for Canadian Studies. Holding a PhD in Canadian history from Concordia University, he has taught at my alma mater, UQAM, Université du Québec à Montréal, and at McGill, where I also studied. Jack's courses have covered the history of immigration in Quebec, ethnic minorities in Quebec, official language minorities in Canada, public policy, and guess what? Sports in Canada. Who knew? He also regularly contributes to essays for books, journals, and newspapers across the country, in addition to authoring various publications and government reports on issues of immigration, multiculturalism, human rights, and official languages. Today, Jack will be presenting his latest work entitled French, English, et les autres, Perceptions and Realities. Jack, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Marlene. I know shortly the PowerPoint that I'm going to present, which will summarize some of the key findings from the research that I'm about to present more widely, will be shown to you. So Chelsea, are you bringing it up? I could do this as well. Okay, perfect. Let's go to right away down to business. Thanks very much for the invitation. And I see from the attendees there are a lot of familiar names and faces which I won't see because Andrew's generously agreed to transfer the questions or share the questions with me, which I'll take. I'll probably spend about half an hour presenting this data to you in terms of the way that it's analyzed. You'll note right away I've kind of changed the title, and so it's a title that's evolving. So currently it's what really underlies the narrative around the decline of French and the Anglicization of Quebec. I've gone through the data quite carefully, and I've been sharing the numbers with my colleagues at STATSCAN because, as many of you are aware, in this particular debate discussion that we're having about language issues and identity, and that's really in large part what underlies the conversations we're having in Quebec. A lot of it is really about identity in as much as it's attempting to frame the data with respect to language knowledge and use. A lot of what underlies the way in which the calculations are made is about identity and the way people construct identity. So let's get right to the point here. And okay, introduction. These are just some of the highlights from STATSCAN's 2016 census in terms of the way that STATSCAN frames the data dissemination in the post-census period. You'll remember that some corrections were required because there were some errors in the 2016 census with respect to overestimations from computer glitches around the numbers, and therefore the shares of English speakers in Quebec actually was about 60,000 odd English speakers by mother tongue, and more so by language spoken at home, that were part of the overestimate in 2016 that thankfully were adjusted. And that also involved adjusting the analytical reports that STATSCAN had already issued at the time in which the data was initially released. So basically, the reason I'm summarizing this information, which is going to be familiar to many of you, is just to give you an idea of how STATSCAN, in its analysis, constructs the findings, which is important because as much as STATSCAN, which I consider a very credible statistical agency, despite the occasional mistake, however significant or that mistake may or may not be, is the agency that everyone looks to, including the government of Quebec, when it generates most of the findings that involve language issues, unless it does some of its own studies, which some organizations in Quebec do undertake some of their own studies on behalf of various government departments. But really the root of most of the data findings are going to be from Statistics Canada. And so the thing I wanted to point out particularly that is going to affect the way in which the findings get interpreted in this presentation is the fourth point, which is the one about French declining as a mother tongue, down from 79.7 to 79.1 in 2016. And the proportion of the population speaking French at home is being described as increasing from 87.1 in 2016 to 87% in 2011. This is for data in Quebec, right? Then the proportion of people speaking French only at home is 71.2, down from 72.8. So you see there's a big variation from the only speaking French at home at the 71.2 to the extent to which French is spoken at home at 87.1, a 16-point variation. And so much is going to depend on the way in which Francophones get defined by whoever the analyst happens to be, whether it's an analyst that arises from STATSCAN or someone that happens to be a demographer that is engaged by the government of Quebec to crunch these particular numbers and interpret them in a way. But the point that I thought was worth illustrating here is just how wide that gap can be. So that 16-point gap really reflects who we define, or who demographers and thought leaders and tabloid pundits and policymakers choose to define as a French speaker in Quebec. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so in Quebec and Ottawa, as many of you know, it's become unthinkable to question the decline of the French language in Quebec. And in fact, I would suggest that it's no longer a question of whether French is in decline, but rather how deep that has been, that decline, or better yet, how much anglicization of Quebec has taken place. A select group of Quebec's most hawkish demographers, it's a term I've recently begun to use, but actually in rethinking this, I think hawkish demographers is probably not the best term. I think it's more, it's probably fairer to describe them as ethnic nationalist demographers. Some Quebec and some federal politicians and a number of pundits have gone so far as to describe the current situation of French as an emergency and contending that French language is in free fall. There's just, as you'll see, no real evidence for that idea. At least no substantive or scientifically valid evidence to support the idea that French is in free fall. Even the idea that French is decline is something that could be challenged and should be challenged were it not for the fact that we're living in a political context that makes it very difficult to challenge what's become orthodoxy, independent of whether it is validated by any meaningful empirical evidence. So beyond the abundant anecdotes that we're all hearing about Montreal retailers that are greeting customers in English, the evidence for this so-called free fall of French language centers principally around three arguments, I would suggest. First, the decline in the weight or share of persons whose mother tongue is French and or speak French most often in their homes across Quebec, but especially on the island of Montreal, this as opposed to the Montreal region. Now, I've argued, as have several others, that we should not be using the island of Montreal as a reference for measuring the weight, respectively, of French, English, or other languages. And again, there's no validation for using the island as opposed to the region, other than the demographers who do so and the government that chooses to do so feel like it, or say that the Montreal Island is the true center, not the region. But you know, the center is a gravitating center, and there's again no demographic justification for its use. But in any event, these demographers claim that on the island of Montreal, French, not so much French speakers, but Francophones, as they happen to define them, are no longer the majority. Right? An argument that, by the way, as I'll show you, we need to absolutely repudiate. The insufficient share of persons whose first language is neither English nor French that are switching to the use of French most often at home, also referred to as language transfers. Again, I point to the idea of insufficient share. Right? Because much of what's being described as a decline or free fall is not so much a question of what's progressing or not, it's what objectives or targets have been established. So if you suggest that the target is the 90% of all transfers, that is to say, of persons who are immigrants, whose whose mother tongue is neither English nor French, 9 of 10 must transfer to French. Failing to achieve that objective, the French language is in decline, then even the progress that you make with respect to the extent to which such transfers go towards French as opposed to English is not going to be considered progress, because it's not reaching an identified objective. So So in other words, it's akin to me saying that, I'm earning $10,000 a year. I got an increase, so I'm at $15,000 a year. That's a 50% increase, but anything less than 20,000 means I'm actually losing money. So that's sort of sorry for that analogy, rightly or wrongly, but that's really what we're seeing here. Finally, a decreasing extent to which Francophones say they are only speaking French most often at their place of work, right? And so we're going to see what the data tells us about that. I'm going to be going through this very quickly, and I apologize. And I know there's a lot of subtlety which we need to understand when it comes to the interpretation of these numbers. So essentially, as I say here, the minority status of French in the island means that there are fewer newcomers that will use French, since Francophones must be in the majority, this is what some argue, to ensure the use of French by others. But as you'll see in the data, this causal or linear relationship is neither supported nor validated by the evolution in the rise of overall knowledge of French, the share of language transfers on the part of allophone newcomers to French, and the use of the French language in the workplace. Go ahead, Chelsea. Next slide. Let's get to the data. So as I say, these assumptions, there are assumptions we absolutely need to challenge. It's going to be hard to undo these arguments because they're pounded away into the population on a regular basis. First, the presumption that non-Francophones constitute another group, right? Another group that is sort of an adversarial group to Francophones, whether it's on the island or the region. And hence, this requires that they be that Anglophones be unjustifiably repositioned as part of a sort of united language front. In other words, the Anglophones get on the Montreal Island, as an example, get positioned as part of a group that includes people whose first language is Creole, whose first language is Arabic, etc., all of whom speak French most often, for the most part, in their homes, but get construed as part of the non-Francophone majority. Because the idea here is to clearly reposition Anglophones on the island of Montreal as part of a majority when combined with the allophone population. Now, one could easily argue that the allophones are the obviously smallest minority on the island from an official language minority standpoint, as is obvious, since they represent, say, in Montreal, whether it's in the island or the region, 20% or thereabouts, between 18 and 22%. That's a minority by any standards. And so the non-Anglophone population represents somewhere between 78 and 82% of the Montreal Island and regional population, respectively. But of course, the argument coming back on that would be, you can't combine the Francophones with the allophones to construct a language group that's sort of pitted against the Anglophone population, right? That would be unacceptable. Therefore, why is it that you can combine the Anglophones with the allophones to construct a language group of sorts, right? So, this is part of the fallacy that has been continually driven to Quebecers and Montrealers, that we need to think in terms of a non-Francophone population that is confronting the Francophone majority, right? Interesting, but not demographically valid or scientifically valid. Second, again, an assumption there's a relationship between the degree to which people speak French in their homes as the driver of newcomer integration to French. That should be determined by what language people speak in the workplace, as we'll see. Let's keep going, Chelsea. I'll get to the data. Keep going to the data. Next. Yeah. Okay. So here's the data for Quebec. Now, what we see here, which is quite interesting, is that the decline in the percentage of Francophones, in this case, I'm using language spoken at home, not mother tongue, but the decline in language spoken at home for French, that's being described as a breakthrough, a threshold that has seen Francophones in Quebec drop under that 80% marker. And keep in mind, every decimal point counts, right, in the sort of way in which the interpretation and data is being unpacked and analyzed. So if it drops from 81 to 80, that's presumed to be a very seismic change, without explaining to what that change might be attributable. So here, when you see this shift, 81 to 79 in the third row of Francophones, right, a 2-point shift over 10 years, to which some nationalist, ethnic nationalist demographers, I would suggest, are drawing considerable attention, and this is being repeated by some of our policymakers, who I feel should know better but don't. When you consider the way in which the distribution of those multiple declarations get done, the actual total French population by language spoken home is at 81.4%. You can see in the bottom row for 2016, as opposed to 82.1% as it was in 2006. Right? So that's a drop of 0.7. Now I'm ceding to those excited demographers that every decimal point counts, right? So they're going to say, but there is a decline, and therefore, there's an urgent situation that purportedly needs to be dealt with. But they'll need to explain to what that decline is attributable to. I happen to think that that's a very, very minor decline. And again, much of the 81 to 79, that 2-point drop, which would be more substantial and breaking some kind of threshold at 80%, is a function of not distributing those multiple declarations. And if we look at the last 4 rows in the middle column, look by how much those multiple declarations have grown, right? English and French jumped by 70% in that 10-year period. English and non-official by 100%. French and non-official language by 150%. I reallocate the total of that group to French, which is something that some demographers will potentially dispute, and allocated 50-50, though there's no rationale for allocating that 50-50 to non-official to French. English, French, non-official, 250% increase. Those are substantial increases. Does it mean that there's more multiplicity of declarations in 2016, 2006? Does it mean the 2006 numbers were less or more accurate than the 2016? I can't say that with certainty, because the context may be such that it contributes to people declaring more multiplicity of their language use at home than was the case 10 years ago. Go to the next slide. So this is in the Montreal region. Here I just want to illustrate it a bit differently, right? But in terms of just giving you an idea of what the magnitude in real numbers is. So if you look at that middle column, here are the changes in real numbers by language spoken most often at home for each of the groups. So for English, it was a 28,000 increase. For French, a 233% increase, 233,000, I apologize, increase in real numbers. Now, we have a tendency in Quebec, and other demographers do the same, not to think about real numbers, but about percentages. So, a real number change, as much significant as can be, needs to be thought of in terms of the ratios of what that'll mean. So despite of that large change in real numbers, it didn't keep pace with the share of the population, which dropped from 67.8 to 65.9%, right? And Anglophones dropped from 16.5 to 15.3 in the Montreal region, right? If you look at the percentages in the columns on the left and on the right. Non-official languages also stayed fairly flat, actually, in percentages, right? So in terms of language spoken often at home. But where were the real gains? The real gains, again, are in those multiple declarations. And look at French and non-official language, a 71,000 person gain, which is largely attributable, by the way, to immigration, which I'll demonstrate shortly. So a 1.3% share of that population in 2006 jumped to 2.9% in 2016. That is a very substantial change. And again, when you do the redistribution of that group, you actually see that in the Montreal region, based on the same redistribution I suggested earlier, which is 50% allocation to English and French, 50% to English and 50% to French of the dual declarations, the full shift of the French non-official to French, and 50% of the English-French non-official to English and 50% to French. I happen to think more of that should be in French, by the way, as opposed to 50-50 distribution. But it is what it is. It still results in a 0.2 increase in the percentage of Francophones in the Montreal region. Next slide. Montreal Island. So here, you've seen basically pretty stagnant numbers in terms of Anglophones, again, by language spoken at home, French by language spoken at home, slight decrease there, but a lot of that has to do with, as we know, off-island movement of French home language speakers to the outlying suburbs in the region, but pretty flat numbers, and so that's going to cause reduced percentages, even reduced percentage of allophones as well. But again, big increases in those multiple declarations. A lot more mixing over the last 10 years, at least reported mixing between French and non-official language groups, or immigrant French speakers who come from non-official language groups that are significantly on the rise in a much higher rate of immigration that Quebec received over the period. Next. So what caused the percentage decline? And, again, for Quebec, we did see that 81 to 79 in French only mother tongue in this case. What is that attributable to? Is it attributable to Anglicization? Well, that would be extremely difficult to validate, since the percentage of of persons whose mother tongue is English that were admitted, according to Quebec government statistics, between 2015 and 2019, in the middle column, second row, is only 2.8%. Right? So as you can see, that there's there's about 8 times the number of immigrants whose first language was French that were admitted to Quebec over that period than persons whose first language was English. The vast majority, overwhelmingly, of immigrants that came to Quebec between 2015 and 2019 were allophones, persons whose first language was neither English nor French. So it's inevitable when 8 out of 10 of your immigrants' first language, mother tongue, is neither English nor French, and 79% of your French population overall is mother tongue French, right? That there's going to be a decrease. So that 81% decrease to 79 in mother tongue French only is almost entirely a function of the proportion of immigrants whose first language, that is mother tongue, was neither English nor French, right? It is not about Anglicization at all. There's just no evidence that any of those decreases have anything to do whatsoever with the English character of your newcomers. Next. Let's go into the data, because running out of time. So this one I thought was interesting because what it shows you, and this is what the Quebec government presents every year. I've rolled it up for 4 periods from 2002 to 2020 in terms of immigration statistics by not mother tongue, but by knowledge of official languages at time of arrival of newcomers. And what you see here is that what the government has done, and I recall from my days being more involved with the Quebec Liberal Party, that what our immigration spokespersons like to do was to accumulate columns A and B into C. So in column C, what their preferred approach to reassuring Quebec francophones about how they were on the right track with respect to immigration and francization was to argue that a majority of people arriving in Quebec in each of these periods, whether it was PQ Liberal or now CAC, were people who knew French, as though that was sufficient. It seems as though knowing French is currently not sufficient whatsoever to diminishing the insecurity that is being promoted by the government for political reasons, and to advance the cause of more stringent language legislation. But what these reports have never done is tell you, as I presented in the column in red, the percentage of people being admitted here that also speak English. So we get that percentage by accumulating column D with column B, right? That is to say, those who speak English only upon arrival and those who speak French and English upon arrival. We accumulate that and we get a high percentage of people who also speak English upon arrival. That doesn't make them English mother tongue. That just makes them happen to speak English. And so what the government is doing is, as I said in the description for this slide, when you take a closer look at the composition of newcomers upon arrival, it's just that Quebec governments generally may value bilingualism more than they care to publicly acknowledge, right? Because even in our point system for Quebec in the economic category, which is under some modification recently, there are some points that are allocated for knowledge of English. So the government probably understands that in the Montreal economy, right, it's important to be bilingual, as many people, for example, who are driving the economy here will attest to. If you go on the website of Montreal International, they'll boast about our bilingual, and for that matter, trilingual character. They'll ask industries and businesses from outside Canada to come here by selling our bilingual character. And yet at the same time, we're now hearing from tabloid pundits, policymakers, and others that bilingualism is the biggest menace to the situation of French in the Montreal economy. Next. In other words, you can't talk out of both sides of your mouth. By the way, just on a point, the point in red, about 38% of those people who spoke English only upon arrival left within 5 years after they got here. So, that would shift the numbers a bit. Next. I got to go faster to get the questions. So next, this is just showing you, by the way, this point of the slide is showing you that if the policymakers tell you that, look, if those are the percentage of immigrants coming in here, that speak English, it's because we don't have control over refugees or family unification. We only control economic jurisdictions through our agreement with the feds. Well, actually, even in the economic class, there's still patterns of admission on the basis of the knowledge of French, English, or neither that are quite similar to what previous governments have done. And a lot of that is out of the control of the government because it seeks certain skills as opposed to strictly language knowledge, where in certain countries, these people who choose to come here are able to speak French and English and or both and or neither, as we know. So it's not like the Quebec government saying, look, we just want immigrants that speak French. It doesn't matter what their skill set is. There are opportunities to do that, but the Quebec government's very mindful of wanting to get the skill set that corresponds to labor market needs here in Montreal and elsewhere in Quebec. Next. Those are just language transfers. So, again, Simon Jean Lamberette and others are arguing that, we need a language transfer rate that's in order for the weight of francophones not to diminish. This is something that Jean Lamberette is just echoing from certain demographers or other pseudo-demographers. So you get sort of the Castonguays and Termots and Bélanger now and others who join in saying that anything under 9 and 10, a transfer rate of 9-to-1 ratio of francophones to anglophones, right, will mean that the weight of francophones will diminish, right, because the 9-to-1 ratio is the ratio of francophones to anglophones in Quebec. So even though prior to 1981, you can see that the tendency was for more of the immigrants to switch to English over French, 56 to 44%. Since then, the tendency is for there to be a 3-to-1 ratio of a shift to French as opposed to English on the part of those newcomers. Now, a lot of it has to do with what those newcomers were predisposed to speak before arrival. So if you are recruiting immigrants from, say, North Africa or Haiti or so forth, they're going to be predisposed to switch to French. And it's also worth noting that language transfers are a multi-generational phenomenon. They don't happen in the first 5 years or less. So they're not always an accurate reflection of what the overall situation is. But the bottom line is that the idea that 9 out of 10 immigrants that are allophone must switch to French in order to sustain the weight of the francophone population is just a wholly unrealistic goal. It would require an immigration policy that would near exclude people that speak English from Quebec. Or for that matter, require an immigration policy that excludes almost anyone who isn't predisposed to switch to French upon arrival. Next. And that's clearly, by the way, not the immigration policy that we're practicing. It's also quite paradoxical, by the way, that the minister reminds us about that 9-to-1 ratio of francophones to anglophones. It seems as though that ratio isn't relevant when we're looking at the island of Montreal, where it's more interesting and politically, I gather, more profitable to accumulate the allophones with the anglophones. And so that's why in the red I'm saying you may appreciate the irony that evoking the ratio of francophones to anglophones, whether it's in Quebec on the whole or Montreal, and removing allophones from the equation, so you're not talking about non-francophones, reminds us how much more weight there is amongst the francophone population relative to the anglophone population. Next. Okay, I'm going to go through the next slides quickly so we get the questions. Go ahead. Yes, as I said, bilingualism is cast as a great advantage in some milieus and platforms, and a great danger elsewhere. Next. Next. Okay, so let's close on these 3 slides. Mother tongue. So this is just the language used most often. Now again, right? What we heard a lot about was that French declined most often in terms of language used in the workplace between sort of in the last 5 years, and I've framed this as 2006 to 16. So in the top 2 rows in red under French, right, you're seeing that decline reflected. 89.7% of the mother tongue French population used French most often at home, right? In 2006, it dropped to 87.3% in 2016, more than a 2.4 point drop, the beginning of the precipice, so to speak. But where did they go, actually? Well, where they went was to English and French, as you can see below, right? So rather than now, so in other words, these people didn't stop using French. What's happened is, even though it's being construed that way by some demographers and policymakers, what happened was that they switched from, let's say, using 75%, I'm giving you an estimate, use of French, to say 50% use of French in their workplace, right? And that's on the part of the 2.4 point decline, right? Okay, so that's it. It is what it is. There are more bilingual workplaces in Montreal, as we know, and the evidence of that is in the following two columns. The one under English, right? So the extent to which English is used most often at work dropped from 70% to 64.2% by Anglophones. In other words, a 6-point drop in the extent to which Anglophones use English most often in the workplace. Amongst allophones, a 7.2% drop in the extent to which they use English most often in the workplace, meaning that if you look at the two rows above, a slight increase in their use of French in the workplace, 1.4, and a 6-point increase in the extent to which they used English and French in the workplace. By any standards, that should be a good thing, because what it means is a 7-point increase in the use of French in the workplace on the part of allophones, and part of Anglophones, a 6-point increase in the extent to which they use French in the workplace. Now, since our colleagues will tell us every point counts, and the 2.4-point change from French being used most often in the workplace to French being used equally with English in the workplace is a precipice setting change for French in free fall. Well, why isn't the 7 points, the 7-point increase on the part of allophones and 6 to 7 respectively, if every point counts, considered a dramatic change and improvement in francization in Quebec? Why? Because nobody even considered mentioning that, because it didn't matter, folks. It doesn't suit the narrative. The reality is there are more bilingual workplaces in Montreal. That is probably a function of globalization, but that's not a terrible thing, in that when more Francophones are interacting with more Anglophones and allophones in those contexts that we see, right, there's going to be more usage of both languages, and it's going to impact the Anglophones and the allophones' use of French, as it is here, to a very significant degree. Next. I want to close shortly. So even though there's a lot more, we could share the PowerPoint presentation with you. So that what I thought was interesting here is, in this sort of idea that majority and minority ratios count, why is it that nobody thought of pointing out that in Montreal, amongst immigrants, right, the language used most often at work jumped from 49.8% in 2006 to, voila, a majority of 52.4% of immigrants using French most often at work in 2016, a 2.6-point increase, a whopping 2.6-point increase. Every point counts, folks. Anglophones, immigrants, dropped from 32.4% use of English most often at work to 24.8%, a whopping 8-point change. True, most of that shift went to English and French amongst immigrants. I acknowledge that, but under any lens, that has to be considered progress for French and has to be considered francization, unless, of course, it doesn't meet a target or objective. Right? As I said, so you're earning $10,000 a year, you get a 50% increase, but you've lost money because your objective was $20,000, even though you're not getting the $20,000. There's just no way that's happening. Next. Okay. That's it. So I think the rest of it was simply about learning the language is not as simple as some might assume. It was some of the data from the QCGN that we did in some polling. Just let's see 1 or 2 slides and that's it. So just to show you, the majority of Quebecers say that learning a second language is difficult. I thought that was an important thing to reflect. That's a lot of the allophones who come here and who over a reasonably short amount of time are able to pick up both, if they don't already know English and French, pick up one or the other or both in a reasonably short order, which is really, really remarkable. That's I think that's an important point to illustrate. You'll hear some stories about stores or commercial establishments in Montreal where a Francophone will walk into the establishment. That person behind the counter at McDonald's was speaking English. They weren't speaking French, right? And they'll be alarmed at that, basically because they're conditioned to believe that everywhere you go in Montreal, it's got to be French is the langue commune de la vie publique. That's what the law prescribes. What that means is really, really interesting. C'est la langue commune de la vie publique. That means everywhere in the public venues, purportedly, you're going to hear French being spoken. That's, of course, not only unrealistic, but establishing that would require something draconian. Now, the government doesn't mean it like that when it talks about la langue commune de la vie publique. It just means that it's the language that everyone should know ideally, right? So not that they should speak in all public venues. That would be nonsense. But when a francophone goes into a McDonald's and hears someone speaking English, you'll hear like something from a tabloid columnist sort of echoing this challenging story. But those persons that are being hired, the best way for them to learn French is actually to work in those environments. That's the funny thing about it. So even if they have a very minimalist knowledge of French and know a few words, if they really want to learn French, and many of them do, that's the best way they can do it. So let me stop there. I did want to just, Chelsea, just flip 3-4 slides quickly. Go forward, 1, 2. This is where people learn French, 3, 4, keep going, keep going. Yeah, this one, this is the last slide. So the reason I use this slide is like, what's the message for francophones, anglophones, and allophones? Now, it's nice for the message to be, look, all the newcomer immigrants who are allophones, they need to just learn French and that's it. And we need to sort of be careful about them engaging with anglophones or participating in English language functions or institutions. But if I were a newcomer here, if I were an allophone, I would look at this particular table, and I'm sure some, well, they don't pick up these tables, but a bit less formal. They would know and know instinctively, I can assure you, that there's a big bonus for being bilingual in Montreal. This is a 25 to 44 group, right? If you're an allophone, it's a $14,000 difference on average income if you speak both languages relative to whether you're a unilingual anglophone or unilingual francophone. Francophones, $14,000 difference. Anglophones, about a $12,000 difference if you're unilingual or you're bilingual. So immigrants that come here, they're a smart bunch, actually. We attract a really smart bunch of people, and they're going to know that, being able to speak those two languages has a tremendous value added. So it doesn't matter what you're hearing from those tabloid journalists at the Journal de Montréal about, how you've just got to join whatever, vision we have of what Montreal should look like. And ideally, those tabloid columnists would like Montreal to look more like a more homogenous area of French Quebec, which is just not in the cards, right? But allophones, as do many anglophones, as do francophones, understand the value of that other language in terms of their economic mobility. So I'll stop there. It'll leave me about, 17 minutes for questions. And that's basically what, I've compiled. And, we're in a very challenging debate, but there are issues that we need to be more strident that are coming from these demographers that we need to repudiate. We need to repudiate certain types of analysis and say that these analyses are not acceptable. They're not demography. And we need to call on some people who are going to be more thoughtful about this and say that we need something a bit more neutral rather than demographic work that's based on identity politics. Stopping there. So Andrew, over to you.
Great, thank you. We're just going to give Andrew 2 seconds to unmute himself. He should be able to. There you go. There he is. Amazing.
Thank you very much for that, Jack. That was super interesting. So I have one question here from Brian Rock. Do we have a sense of what percentage of francophones in the province of Quebec consider themselves federalists as opposed to section Q, as opposed to sovereign, like nationalists?
Well, look, I don't make those, to be honest, you, Brian. Like, I just don't make those distinctions between federalists and nationalists, there are nationalists who are federalists and nationalists who are sovereignists, and there are sort of multiple types of nationalists in Quebec. If I'm going to be honest, it's very hard to sort of put that in boxes in terms of what people's identities are and how they get framed and so forth. So it would be hard for me to answer that question. I could tell you how many people would vote yes, what percentage would vote yes if the referendum held today, and I think we need to be cautious about the way in which those findings get intertwined with some of the demographic findings, because actually, whether it isn't only sovereignists that are the ones who are sort of disseminating or communicating this information about the situation of French and English respectively and allophones. It's a wide spectrum of people across ideologies in Quebec that do that. And so we need to be careful about how we, how we address that. So I know that probably doesn't satisfy your question, but if you want to know where the sovereignty referendum issue stands, it's probably about where it's always been, 35-65 or 35-40, and sort of 60 one way, 40 the other way. Of course, Brian, those were the polling results before the referendum in 1995, at least about 3-4 months before. So I wouldn't take any of that stuff to the bank.
Okay, so while I wait for a few more questions to come in, I wanted to ask you quickly, Jack, if given all the information you just shared, and I don't think this is unknown to everyone here, I think we understood that the debate is being skewed. Do you have any tips or advice to how to convey this to the other side?
Well, I actually think that this is a bit challenging, that the people who are the principal architects of disseminating this information, those journalists at the Journal de Montréal and some other columnists, we need to call them out. We don't call them out enough. We're far too polite with them, and because we're worried that, they've got more capacity to attack us, if you like, with their particular platforms and diminish our credibility. But I think that's a risk that we're going to have to take. We're in a real period of risk mitigation. We're learning a lot about risk mitigation in this environment we lived in for the past 18 plus months. And so I think there's going to have to be some risk mitigation, and we'll have to call these people out, whether it's, the Matthew Bock-Côtés or Denise Bombardier or Richard Martineau or Michel David or what's the name of that person at Le Devoir, Robert Sans-Façon, and others who continue to repeat this information, and Simon Jolin Barrette and others. We'll have to just call them out. Not just, in other words, we have to not only focus on the issue of the legislation itself. We'll have to question whether, when Simon Jolin Barrette echoes some of these statements being made by these demographers who are practicing some kind of voodoo demography, that he needs to take a harder look at the data he's presenting. Now, they'll cut the numbers in different ways, and there's ways they can cut the numbers on language at work by incorporating something called regular use at work, which I noticed the Office de la Langue Française, or whichever name they currently go by, use the regular use at work, which they shouldn't do, in order to give the impression that English was rampant in workplaces across Quebec. By the same logic of use of the term regular, almost everyone in Quebec is speaking French in the workplace at some point in the day. I mean, there are different ways of cutting this thing, but by and large, we need to call those people out. We've wasted too much time, and we should not worry about the backlash from their social media followers when you call them out, because once you do that, you're going to get a whole string of social media followers of like hundreds of people who will call you all kinds of fun things and whatever, and you'll have to just not take that. You'll have to let that roll off your back and say it's too bad that these people who are a bit confused feel that way. Like, I don't blame them for being confused, by the way. If I were being told every single day that French is in decline and we're a minority in the island of Montreal, if that kept being repeated every single week by someone in those tabloid newspapers elsewhere, I agree, it's hard to undo that, and when we do polling, 75% of Francophones think French is on the decline. It's just on the decline. Every argument you give them, it's on decline everywhere, right? 75% of Anglophones think it's not, right, on decline. So someone's obviously either naive or not seeing what's going on. So those 75% of Anglophones, presumably from the perspective of the Francophones, don't know what they're talking about, right? But the Anglophones see more French everywhere, and the Francophones presumably see more English everywhere because of the way in which we're conditioned to understand what the objectives are. Anglophones will think French has progressed because they're going to look at the data, and yes, French has progressed. and Francophones will, a lot of them are looking at in terms of what the objective is. So if I tell you the objective is French has got to be wall to wall, yeah, you're never going to reach that objective, right? You'd have to re-engineer Montreal to reach that objective, right? And so if that's your benchmark or your target, yeah, you're always going to think it's in a decline, in a perpetual state of decline, So that's it's challenging to get around that, What really also bothers me is that, our minister, Melanie Joly, right, who is giving validity to those points of view and those demographers, also regrettably, as much as she's a fine person and is funding many of your organizations, as are some instances of the government of Quebec, Thankfully, I've checked my funding. I've got most of it secure for the next 3 to 5 years. So, there's going to be a bit of concern about, your funding situation if you're dependent on funds from Melanie Joly or from the government of Quebec, your organizations are. But, unfortunately, we're going to have to step forward and call them out and say, look, Melanie, with all due respect, right, we appreciate your concern for the situation of the French language, which there's always a need to be concerned. We appreciate you're listening to us carefully about the situation of Anglophones, but right now you're echoing arguments that are being made by these demographers and giving them validity that just don't stand up to any demographic justification. And we're going to have to call you out on that. We're going to have to say, Melanie, Jolie, it's really unfortunate you're doing that because you're damaging the social fabric of our society for purposes of trying to secure more support, it would seem, politically in Quebec. That's a tough statement. But, and we can't, unfortunately, get Melanie Joly to engage in a debate with us. I'd love to say, hey, Melanie Joly, come debate me about these issues, right? Come, get your advisors to give you the numbers, whoever's advising you, and you come present those numbers. But, I greatly doubt she's a minister. She's not going to do that. Well, find somebody who's going to do that, because otherwise, if not, stop repeating these things that are simply not scientifically validated. They're not demography.
So then on that note, I actually have 2 questions for you from that. So one of them is, did you apply to present at the Bill 96 hearings? And if so, were you successful or not?
No, I did not apply. So
okay. Secondly, then, given all the data you just presented to us, you kind of presented one brief spin of data for 25 to 44-year-olds. Do things change between gender, between age groups, in terms of knowledge of French, bilingualism, stuff like that?
Yeah, I think, in terms of age, there's a generational effect. The younger cohorts of English speakers are more bilingual. It's been pretty flat, actually. We've not seen a real significant advance in terms of the sort of 75% of English speakers that speak French right now, right? It's sort of plateaued out there. It's gone maybe up 1 or 2 points. There's always going to be a core of unilingual English speakers. Some of them are coming through the immigration stream, and Quebec government is admitting them, as the data demonstrates. Some of them are coming as interprovincial migrants from other provinces. I've got 3-4 people on my staff right now are from Ontario. They're all taking very, very intensive French lessons. I mean, they are dying to learn French. Are they bilingual? Not yet, but I'm very confident. Some of them actually are bordering on, on more on getting there. But there's going to be a critical mass of people in Montreal and the rest of Quebec, more so in Montreal, that will speak English only in a transitionary stage. But there are some generational differences, and the older, persons in the baby boom plus group are less bilingual, less likely to speak French. They're not going to learn French at this particular stage in their life cycle either. So that's to be expected. Are we going to tell those people that you can't work in Quebec because you have to speak French to work in Quebec? That would be very, very draconian. So anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
So then going forward, do you know of any credible French demographers who are presenting the kind of the nuanced picture that you are, and that we can maybe partner with?
Yeah, I think Victor Pichet is one of them, who sometimes writes for Metro. I think Richard Marcoux is one of them. I think Jean-Pierre Corbet, who used to work for STATSCAN and who's now sort of out a little bit more of a free agent, who wrote a really smart essay in Le Devoir about language transfers not being the benchmark for measuring the state of French, which was a very thoughtful piece. He's one of them. But their capacity to speak out publicly without getting slammed down is challenged. That's why Richard Marcoux, who's a really thoughtful person, is going to be careful. He's going to, even I do this with a fair bit of trepidation. Like, I've had some misgivings about doing this because I've got to say, hey, I go out there and I'm going to get major pushback and my reputation will be attacked, and I don't need it. I've got a lot of other stuff on my plate right now. I'm really finding a lot of the work we're doing, as Marlene can tell you, since she's on my board, is really, really fascinating stuff. So I don't need this, but it's also hard for me to watch this, to be fair. When I see our federal minister, which really, really triggered me, when I see our federal minister, someone I have a fair degree of respect for, right, echo these arguments, it's very, very frustrating. And when I see that Emmanuel Lambrelopoulos, someone who I don't happen to know very well, but is turned into a scapegoat and a poster person for the for these ethnic nationalist demographers to attack, it's disconcerting, because whether she's right or wrong, the fact she raised the issue of the French language being purportedly in decline or so-called decline is a question that she needed answered, not simply told that she can't do that. And she's fortunate that it was just limited to her having to get off the committee and not being dismissed from her political party or being the object of some kind of a censorship motion in Quebec, which our government, I think, does really, and sometimes in an ill-considered way. She needed to look at the data, and not from Mario Beaulieu, who is also one of these federal politicians who, with the Bloc, presents the data in extremely skewed ways, for very partisan purposes. And clearly, the way the data is cut by those people is not, corresponding to any, demographically valid rule. I mean, we need to go to whatever body of demographers that, or others that provide some rules for doing this, because, what these individuals are doing is not demography.
Interestingly enough, the committee ended up studying the situation in the second half of the session this year. So her question was raised and they ended up studying the question afterwards. I don't know how much time we have left, but I have one final question I wanted to run by you. Has there ever been a study done to see what the situation in Quebec is like in comparison to other kind of bilingual countries or nations in Switzerland?
There are not many, actually. There are not many, and there could be some where it's done. But on that point, let me say this, right? Because one of the two things I really think, so we're on the sort of last point here, that we need to pay more attention to, and I appreciate as a QCGN, you have a specific mandate, right, which is to defend the concerns and interests of the English-speaking community, right? You can interpret that in varying ways. On Bill 21, for example, QCGN went out and took a position when some could have argued that that bill doesn't directly affect the English-speaking community, right? So per se, I recall some of these debates because I used to be in the employ of the Jewish community here, and we'd have some of those discussions before taking positions on whether an issue had a direct impact on us or an indirect one, and how indirect that impact was, whether we should intervene accordingly. So in the same way, the English language population of Canada, the percentage of the English population also in the same 10-year period diminished, right, by percentage or by weight, right? Its diminishing by weight was a function of the composition of immigration, right? So the two issues that I think as English advocacy organizations, we need to go beyond this idea that we're defending the interests of English speakers are immigration and bilingualism. I actually think they're nice segues for both those issues, where, as communities, as Quebecers, we have a role and a right to speak about those issues more globally, not just as they affect English speakers, in other words. Because really, it's, as I pointed out, and the numbers are quite clear, including the forecast done by the Office de la langue française for the future share of the French population will be conditioned by the percentage of allophone immigrants coming to Quebec. And there's a decision that Quebec has to make. Quebec also repeats that it needs immigrants, right? Our policymakers have said over and over, till François Legault, who's diminished immigration a bit, but isn't saying we don't need immigration, numbers are going to come back up, that we need it, that Quebec needs immigration. So if it does need immigration, but it wants to sustain the balance or percentage that French represents within society, then it'll have to be mindful about how the immigration admissions and the background linguistically of those who come here responds to that changing pattern, right? Otherwise, I mean, it's inevitable when you've got 80% of your population is French and 80% of the people coming here every year are allophone, that ratio is going to change. You need to make a decision. If you don't bring immigrants here, you're going to see population declines. We saw that during the COVID period. We saw mortality rise above birth rates. We saw low immigration, and there was a period in which the Quebec population went into decline, right? It had negative growth. Those are societal decisions. And the same finally for bilingualism, right? Bilingualism can't be sort of bad for Francophones, but good for Anglophones and allophones, right? There's some disconnect there, right? So Anglophones and Francophones and allophones in Montreal interact and mix on levels that are very unequal in lots of other places, right? In North America, I mean, there's mixing between English and other, but not English, French, and other in the same way, right? Between these majorities and minorities and so forth, and others. And you see that in parts of the United States in the Spanish and English populations. But again, it's more dichotomous, whereas here it expresses itself in multiples. So we'll have to see. That's what the root of the issue is as well. Those demographers will exclude those multiple declarations, right? And by excluding those multiple declarations of French and other, right, or French and English from their calculation, they're going to give you the lowest or minimalist version of the Francophone share of the population. And what underlies that is who's a Francophone, who's a Francophone, and who's not a Francophone, right? And so the bilingualism issue and the mixing and interaction and so forth is something that we need to think about as organizations, as Quebecers, and as members of civil society, and probably need to thoughtfully engage in that debate.
Jack, thank you so much. I could sit here and talk stats with you all day, but I believe Marlene has the last words. So thank you very much.
I do. First of all, thank you so much, Jack, for all of this really important information. And I hope that it will be available to all of the participants, the PowerPoint, 1, 2. Andrew, thank you so much for providing the questions that our participants asked and adding on a few as well, because every single question that was asked was really interesting, pertinent, and I think that Jack gave some great information here. Thank you to all of the participants for giving up an hour of your evening time away from work, so to speak, is always precious. So thank you very much, and keep up the great work, Jack. Good evening, everyone. And with that, we call this meeting to a close.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.